Have you ever wondered why cars went from looking like this to this in a matter of years? How did Lamborghini go from this to this? Why did sports cars start looking like large cheese wedges? What if I told you that the company most known for consistently making curvy cars through history, the unlikeliest of culprits, is actually somewhat responsible for this move towards angular designed sports cars? That's right, blame it on Porsche. Well, sort of.
Porsche.
Just for reference, I've linked the sources for this video down in the description, the primary being this article about the history of the Tapiro. Check that out if you're interested in diving in yourself. I've also linked a free ebook that's really awesome by Guy Durkin and Jeffrey Hacker on the subject of wedge cars and their origins, and that's a really good resource as well. Now, the idea and execution of the wedge car actually dates back before the cars we're talking about today. Like all great car designs, it starts with a prophecy, dating far back before any triangular wedge-shaped car had ever come out, and I'm not kidding. In a 1957 article of Road and Track titled Driving the Wedge, or After 1960 What? Don't you love that title? In that article, Strother McMahon details the history up to that point of cars, and often race cars, using what he called a wedge-shaped front end, whether vertical or horizontal, and this was used primarily for better aerodynamics. And this idea dates back to the very early days of motoring. Despite primarily being reserved for competition, this notion was already starting to enter into regular vehicle design, but with only serious prominence in really concept cars, mainly coming out of Italy. And these weren't full wedge cars. McMinn points out that concept cars are usually a signpost for where manufacturers are going, and here's how his article ends. However, you can be just as sure that when the last vestige of carriage tradition and its interim child, the motorized calliope, have faded away, we'll finally be wedging our way over the multi-level, super sonar barricaded, pulse-guided freeways of the future, and it may not be far away. So McMinn believes that in the future, we will be wedging our way through whatever these futuristic highways will be. And though the ultimate future of sports car design may not have stayed this way, the wedge was certainly coming. Fast forward some 10 years, and we see what many, including the authors of that ebook, consider to be the first really full-blown version of a wedge-shaped car. Though it's difficult to say what the actual first is because it did evolve, the 1966 Canera is a really good candidate. Designed by Ray Canera in his junior year of college for his studies at the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles, this is a car that was really far ahead of its time. As the 1960s came to a close, this idea of the front end of the sports car being shaped like a wedge was beginning to take hold among many designers, especially in Italy. Not just for aesthetic reasons, as we saw in McMinn's article, it also has been about performance and aerodynamics. Perhaps the most influential early wedge car was the 1968 Alfa Romeo Carrabbo, designed by Marcello Gandini, working for the Bertone studio. Don't correct me on any of these names, guys. I know I'm probably not getting any of them right. This car would really lay the foundation for later wedge cars that would come into existence, like, for example, the Countach, which was also designed by Gandini. But how does Porsche fit into all this? I mean, once we got to the end of the 60s, wasn't Porsche just busy selling 911s? What could they possibly have to do with this new, rather Italian trend? Well, Porsche had already began experimenting with departures from their tried and true formula at this point. The Volkswagen Porsche Collaborative 914 was in the works. Not only was that car not very Porsche in terms of performance, it also didn't really follow the design language of Porsche. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Porsche's 917 race car showed radical signs of, shall we say, wedginess. So it's not entirely surprising that Porsche and Volkswagen decided to partner with the newly created design studio Ital Design and its founder Giorgetto Giugiaro to make a new kind of car. Their goal was to attempt to build a car fully dedicated to the new wedge design as a design concept in and of itself, not mainly as an experiment in performance, to see what people would think of this new trend. Now, the idea that this new design for this car was essentially form over function is pretty clear, because it was not built on the 911. No, it was built on that new Volkswagen Porsche collab 914. Not exactly a supercar as, more recent wedge designs had been. The 914 was like a low-level Porsche, but a high-level Volkswagen, if that makes sense, and it was an attempt at really just creating cash flow for both companies. A specific version of the 914 would lay the foundation for this new radical car. Though sold only as a Porsche here in the States, the 914 was primarily a Volkswagen, powered by the company's 4-cylinder 80 CV engine. But when Porsche decided to make the 914/6 powered by the 6-cylinder Boxer directly out of the 911, then it seems like the groundwork was laid for this new car. This was something like a mid-engined 911. With hopes of making a totally futuristic car, Ital designer Giorgetto Giugiaro decided to go full wedge, and he went to Volkswagen in hopes of using this car for that purpose. Now, the primary goals with the Tapiro were safety, aerodynamics, and really just a fully realized version of the wedge concept. This meant an entirely flat, long hood, flat surfaces just all over the car, with all of it coming down to a point in the front, angles where cars had previously had curves, and also large glass panels all the way around for amazing visibility. It also had gull-wing doors, and amazingly enough, unlike so many prototypes which are essentially just shells, this was a fully functional car, almost entirely ready for production. Of course, they would have to add mirrors, but that's common. The rear glass panels also flipped up like the doors, exposing the engine, and the gull-wing doors and rear hood hinge on a steel cross structure that runs the long ways down the car and also functions as a roll bar. So this was pretty cool stuff, especially for the late 60s. Now, there's actually a bit of mystery surrounding the car, specifically the engine. What I said about the 914/6 being the foundation for this car, that's actually somewhat debated. We know that the Tapiro was powered by an engine. It wasn't just an empty hunk of metal, and we'll get into why that is later. And we know it was a 6-cylinder engine, but we don't know for sure that it was indeed powered by the flat 6 from the Porsche 914/6. Reason would tell us that the Tapiro in its first unveil in 1970 should have come with the regular 4-cylinder engine out of the 914, as that special 6-cylinder 914 actually had yet to come into production. But we know from sources that it didn't have a 4-cylinder engine, it had a 6. So what 6? It's possible that the car actually came with a completely different version of the 911 flat 6, not the one made for the 914 later on. It's all a bit mysterious, and some of it's lost to history for reasons that we'll see soon, but yeah, very interesting. Now, this new concept car called the Tapiro was first unveiled in 1970 at the Turin Auto Show. This would be the start of a tour for the car around the world, even heading to the major US shows in 1971. And hopes were high that this radical looking car could actually make it to production as a Porsche. But would the company be bold enough to make a car like this for regular people? A car that just completely abandoned all of their design language. How much would it cost, and would this be the future of car design? There was one problem though. Remember that 914, the car that the Tapiro was essentially built on? And remember how Porsche and Volkswagen decided to make a 6-cylinder version of it using the Boxer engine from the 911, making the 914 a sort of mid-engine 911? Yeah, that car didn't go over well. Very few sold. Enthusiasts just wanted a 911 if they were going to spend that kind of money. So Porsche was afraid to take the Tapiro to production. If enthusiasts didn't want the 914/6, would they really want this kind of crazy odd version of that car? It was clear the Tapiro wasn't going to be the future for Porsche, so it just kind of kept touring around as a concept car and as kind of a symbol for this new kind of design, a style that other companies would take up and run with to its fullest extent. The final stop of its tour would come in 1973 at the Barcelona show in Spain. There, a Spanish businessman would actually buy the one and only Tapiro in existence, and after using the car as his daily driver, that's how we know it had an engine, by the way, the car would find its way into the hands of the famous Argentine composer Waldo de los Rios. Here the Tapiro would experience a sad demise. See, the Porsche 914/6 that this car was in essence based on was known to catch fire primarily because of float failure in the triple carbs. And that's exactly what would happen to the Tapiro, though there's all sorts of stories about how it ended up catching fire, many of them political and having to do with conflicts going on in Spain, but this is really what happened. And that happened while Waldo was driving the car. In 77, after Waldo's death, his wife would take the car and store it behind their house, and there it sat for decades, abandoned along with the rest of the property, but somehow the little weird wedge survived, found by a collector in the 1990s, and in the end, Ital Design, that's the studio that designed the Tapiro, were able to retrieve the car, and it now lays in their studio, unrestored, just kind of left in its sad, burnt state. Now, Ital Design would end up one of the single most important design studios in automotive history, so it's not as if everything was moot. It's not like this is the only car they would end up designing, but imagine you pour your heart and soul into the design of a new radical car, a car that you believe could and maybe should, and also in a weird roundabout way would be the future, and then that car never goes into production, but other cars that are very similar looking do. And then somebody gets the car and then it's just kind of lost to history. And then you get it 25 years later and you're reunited with that one single car and your son is standing by you and there it is, burnt to a crisp. This photo may be one of the single most poetic photos in automotive history, the reuniting of the single toasted Porsche Tapiro with its original designers. Imagine what that must have felt like. Imagine you right now were reunited with your high school car decades later and it's just essentially destroyed. And now imagine if that wasn't just your first car that you drove, but you also created that car, you designed it and made it become a reality. It's a pretty amazing story. Automotive design changes often follow cultural shifts. The emergence of wedge-shaped cars and just more angular vehicles versus what we saw through the 50s and 60s represented change in the world as a whole, whether cultural or political. But wedge-shaped cars and fully committed angular designs would essentially have their day. But are they gone entirely? The concept has actually made a comeback, you guessed it, with the Tesla Cybertruck. I'm hoping that just saying Tesla Cybertruck in my video just makes this video start trending. And in spite of this long history of wedge cars, the unveiling of the Cybertruck was apparently just as shocking to the world as a car like this or, the Lamborghini Countach. Maybe Tesla fanboys aren't students of automotive histories. There's really nothing radical here in terms of overall design. If anything, it's retro, not futuristic. It's what people kind of thought the future would look like 60 years ago. But is it the future today? Could the wedge shape make a comeback in automotive design? And maybe this is the time for Porsche to bring the Tapiro back. Yeah, I doubt it.